Good morning, MCLS. I am doing this video as a preparation for some YouTube closed captioning testing and instructions. I'm going to read a rather long missive here. You can skip forward if you like, or you can listen to it. It's quite a funny story. And then I'm going to take this text and we're going to experiment with a few different ways of using closed caption. I know the goal here is to enable Facebook Premiere so that we can show one-time videos set up on Facebook. Now, I have found through the playing that I've done that I believe Facebook's video posting system is a ported version of YouTube. They are identical. But the one major difference is when you're editing closed captioning in YouTube, it's clean, it's stable, and it works very well. When you're doing it in Facebook, you want to rip your face off and hit it with a book because it's horrible. And you can ask Casey and Mo, who have used it ahead of me. It's just probably one of the most awful interfaces I've used. It's just too buggy. Now, who is sending me a message? You need to be quiet over here. I'm recording. Sorry. So I'm going to go ahead and read this little story. I'm going to bring it over here on my monitor. This is a 3-hour tour. This is a tour that my wife and I took when we were visiting her brother. So let's go ahead and read this. A recollection of the events of Wednesday, July 3rd, 2013. Joan and I were staying with Joan's brother and sister-in-law, Richard and Denise. Wednesday morning, they both went to work. Joan and I ventured out on a Hobie 2-seat kayak. We paddled out into the lake and struggled with it to keep it going in a straight line. Must have been the wind, who knows. We finally gave up and headed back to their dock. While we were paddling close to shore, Richard was approaching the shoreline. He had left work early. That's a privilege when you own your own company. Richard saw us struggling and yelled out, "Why don't you lift the rudder out of the water? It will make it easier to steer." I've been summoned to the court Monday to have my surname changed from Seaman to Landlubber. Shameful. We then proceeded to board his pontoon boat. Lovely craft with plenty of seating and nice canopy to shade us from what little sun came out over this week. Richard was mulling his alternatives and wanted to formulate a plan. Something I can relate to, as I like to be sure I know what to expect as well. Then in walks his neighbor. For privacy reasons, we'll change his name to Nelson, in honor of the great Admiral Nelson of the British fleet. Admiral Nelson is a man on a mission, and nothing will divert him from accomplishing this mission. Admiral Nelson's mission this day was to see that Richard and his crew, me and Joan, make it past the thick reeds and grass on the lake's edge and into the lake itself. Richard insisted he wasn't ready to voyage out, but Admiral Nelson persistently ordered him to cast off. This battle raged on for at least 30 minutes. With having more to lose by defying Admiral Nelson, Richard agreed to start his motor and make way out into the lake. Admiral Nelson gave Richard explicit instructions on how to accomplish this task safely. The horror that followed will be etched in my mind forever. The lake that Richard lives on was recently drained so that a dam could be repaired. 2 weeks prior to our arrival, the lake was still relatively empty. Constant rain these past 2 weeks filled the lake in record time, but it wasn't at its fullest when Admiral Nelson ordered us to get underway. Without going into the gory details, I will tell you what followed. Richard tilted the engine up so that he could clear the grass and mud on the bottom of the lake's shoreline. The water was still too shallow as the propeller became entangled with grass and the cooling system sucked up enough mud to overheat the engine. By the time we made it out onto the lake, the engine had died and we were sent adrift. We attempted, in what was obviously an effort in futility, to paddle our way back to the dock from whence we departed. On a clear day, this would have been a laborious task, but one in which we could have succeeded. This was not a clear day. Overcast skies, threats of storms, and high winds hampered every effort at salvaging the day. The winds blew us into the shoreline opposite of our destination. As we struggled to push away from the shore and continued to paddle in vain, who do you suppose we saw approaching in a 9-foot John boat but Admiral Nelson? Admiral Nelson arrived at our location and positioned himself at our stern. He then proceeded to dismantle the engine, yes, in the water. His intention was to clean the fouled spark plug. After several attempts to open the engine cover, he determined it was necessary to have someone in the boat with him to steady it. He asked me to transfer to his vessel, a 9-foot John boat, the very essence of instability. Knowing I had a bad back and not wanting me to injure it further, our fearless Captain Richard told Admiral Nelson that he would transfer into the John boat. As Richard began to climb in the boat, Admiral Nelson shifted his weight and the boat tipped, dumping Admiral Nelson into the lake. Of course, he blamed this on Richard. Now that both men were in the John boat, Admiral Nelson asked me to grab the line and hold the John boat steady as Richard sat helplessly in the stern. While Admiral Nelson wanted someone in the boat if he was going to work bow to stern instead of perpendicular to the pontoon boat still remains a mystery in my mind, but I digress. As I reached over the stern to grab the line, the bench seat below my knees caved in. I shifted my weight over to the left to stabilize myself. Admiral Nelson cleaned the spark plugs and attempted to put the cover back on the engine, but the cover would not cooperate. He asked me to place the latch in the hole, so I did. He still could not get the cover to engage, insisting I properly place the latch in the hole. I insisted it was, but he was not able to cover the engine. This was my fault, so Admiral Nelson climbed into the pontoon boat to do it himself. As he climbed over the rail, he too collapsed the bench even further. His attempts to do what I tried were met with the same resistance. He then needed me to move over to my left even more. Now both of us were on the bench when it totally collapsed in a cracking heap of plywood and seat cushion. Richard's eyes were red with fury, so much so the water around the John boat began to boil. Admiral Nelson finally got the cover on the engine. It was time to maneuver the John boat into deeper water so the engine could be lowered and started. We began to push off the shore, but every effort we made was encountered by the wind pushing us back. Seeing the futility of our efforts, our fearless Captain Richard determined it was necessary to exit the John boat and enter the water to push the pontoon boat into deeper water. His first thought was to save his wallet. He took his wallet out of his shorts and threw it toward the boat. Unfortunately, the wind decided to gust and the wallet was blown into the canopy rigging, which acted like a taut rubber band, and bounced it right into the lake. The fish around the John boat were cooked to a delectable tenderness by the boiling water. Richard immediately jumped into the water and began the search and rescue effort. Admiral Nelson's directives immediately followed, barking orders on how to find the wallet. I had had enough and jumped into the water to assist my brother-in-law. Admiral Nelson saw the mutiny beginning and determined it was better to follow me in. We started searching in Richard's general vicinity. All the while, a group of neighbors had gathered at the shore and were offering their assistance. Admiral Nelson asked Joan to pass him the broken lawn rake that was in the boat so he could start to search the bottom for the wallet. The rake had no handle and the water was too deep actually to make it effective. The neighbors came out with 3 long-handled rakes which were much more effective, but Admiral Nelson was insistent that the broken rake was better and continued to use it. His plan was for Richard to stand at one point and me at another, and he would rake up between us. Then we would both take a step and we would search the next strip. I saw 2 problems with this method. 1, he started to search way too far away from where Richard's wallet entered the water, and 2, there was a storm over our heads. We didn't have time for this. It was at this point I decided to start my mutiny. Joan kept pointing to an area 15 feet from where Admiral Nelson was searching. Admiral Nelson kept telling me to hold my position. Bunk this. I moved over to where Joan was pointing and began to search the muck-covered lake bed with my bare feet. Richard had given up on Admiral Nelson's ridiculous plan as well and had started to search the lake bed too. With Joan's directions and pointing me in the general vicinity, I was able to quickly locate the wallet under my foot. I made sure it was a wallet and not a clump of grass like I had felt so many of, and once determined it was our goal, I reached down and clamped my hand firmly around it to ensure I had it and all its contents. I victoriously raised the wallet from the lake, completed with its handful of grass and presented it to Richard. The relief on Richard's face cooled the water back down to normal and revived all the boiled fishes so they could live another day. Only Admiral Nelson was feeling the heat now. We returned the tools to the neighbors, thanked them for their help, and boarded the pontoon boat. Richard climbed back in the John boat. He was going to take that back to the dock and let Admiral Nelson bring the pontoon boat back. Admiral Nelson fired up the engine and began to head towards the dock. We were halfway there when he decided to turn around and go the other way, avoiding some of the grass which had caused the initial trouble. Why he didn't speed up the boat and cut the engine, allowing us to coast directly into the dock, still baffles me, but he turned the boat around and went the long way, allowing the engine to run longer with a clogged cooling system. At some point, the engine died. Admiral Nelson restarted the engine, and when the propeller took hold, it jolted forward, knocking Admiral Nelson off his balance. He then fell into the wooden table, which resisted with a snapping and crackling sound as it split in two. We arrived at Admiral Nelson's dock and coasted to it after the engine died its last death. Admiral Nelson had us tie up to the dock. After all this, after all the sputtering, the knocking, the smoke, and the clogging noises, Admiral Nelson said, "It certainly idles well." Joan laughed so loudly that it startled Admiral Nelson. He looked at her puzzled, as he saw no humor in what he said. I was cracking up as well. To this day, Admiral Nelson doesn't know what was so funny. Richard had tied the John boat up to Admiral Nelson's dock and walked over to where we were moored. He didn't want to leave his pontoon boat there and insisted we move it back to his own dock, so he and Admiral Nelson maneuvered the last 100 feet to Richard's dock. He somehow got that engine to run one more time. Joan was long gone, hoofing it back to Richard's lakeside manor. Once the pontoon boat was safely moored at Richard's dock, Admiral Nelson conveniently disappeared, needing to get out of his wet clothes. Richard and I inspected his floating wreck and determined the pontoon survived, so it was still salvageable. But in 30 minutes, under Admiral Nelson's direction, we managed to destroy Richard's pride and joy. The next day, we disassembled all the broken pieces. There's a lot of them. I feel bad that I have to leave tomorrow. I would love to be part of this restoration project, a project that is certainly doable, as long as Admiral Nelson stays far away. Okay, so now you are listening to the edited version that took all of my takes, but we are going to stop now and we're going to prepare to do the closed captioning.